things first, Rachel went ahead and put a survey evaluation link in that chat box there. So any comments or any additional feedback for me would be much appreciated. And then secondly, I would appreciate if all of the questions were to be left towards the end. Also, just put it in the chat box or raise your hand. So to get started here, my name is Julie Olzak. I will be presenting on intuitive eating and the effects on eating behaviors. So just a quick outline here. I'll start with an introduction and kind of describe why this topic was chosen. I'll get into a little bit about the history and definition of intuitive eating, talk about a literature review, and then present my take-home message. So to start, I'm going to ask you all to use that hand raise function at the bottom there, and then just raise your hand if you use social media. Great, okay. So keep your hands up if you see a lot of posts that are nutrition related on social media. Awesome. So we may be biased with the posts that we see since we are in the field of nutrition, but how do these posts reflect on the average user who may not know as much about nutrition? I know I see a lot of posts on nutrition because that's just kind of what like my feed is gauged towards. And the majority of the time, I don't know if I quite believe everything that is out there. And moreover, much of what we see on social media is body comparisons, schemes to get thin quick, and what I eat throughout the day posts. So a conclusion from a psychology study in 2016 concludes that social media use is associated with body image concerns, particularly if the users are engaging in certain kinds of activities on social media, such as making appearance comparisons to others. So a lot of the posts that I personally see on social media are related to intuitive eating. Now, I don't have a background in this practice prior, so I did a little social media research to determine what messages this nutrition practice entails. So in doing so, I did a little search on Instagram for hashtag intuitive eating. Now, I have to say all of these posts that I'm going to be showing have been given me, well, the users of these posts have granted me permission to use their posts. And then in a little chat, the majority of these users are really excited that I was bringing the point of this practice along to other people in the nutrition field. So one of these first posts is kind of like a before and after. So it says how it started versus how it's going. So how it started is, working out, being concerned about body images, and then the how it's going kind of looks like free eating and eating whatever you'd like. So the second one here, it's a girl eating a donut. So the caption says, intuitive eating may seem scary or difficult, but once you start, the results are life-changing. Still doesn't tell me that much about intuitive eating other than the fact that you could eat whatever you want, right? So next here, we have a few signboards of messages that kind of entail intuitive eating. So the first one here says, a food label has no idea what serving size will be satisfying for you. The second one talks about yo-yo dieting. Specifically, it says, you're not your mom and you don't need diets like keto, like she thought she did. And then the last one here says, health at every size is an anti-health. It's anti-weight stigma. So we know that it involves kind of not exactly going with the flow of typical diets and also accepting your body for what it is. And then lastly, along my search, I got a lot of posts for other types of food, like what I eat throughout the day, some eggs, some oats, different recipes like that as well. So my research question here is, what exactly is intuitive eating, and what is the impact that it has on eating behaviors between different populations? And further, how can it be incorporated into future MNT practices? So first, what is intuitive eating? I have to mention that the original intuitive eating pros, so the people who kind of brought this into the light, um, kind of observed more research and published many books on intuitive eating, are Evelyn Tribal and Elise Resch. They're both dietitians. They're both certified eating disorder registered dietitians, and they are the founders of the original intuitive eating pros. So while looking on their website, they list 10 principles of intuitive eating. So this kind of describes what this practice entails. So the first is to reject the diet mentality, honor your hunger, make peace with food, discover the satisfaction factor, feel your fullness, respect your body, honor your health, general nutrition. So some of these principles mostly describe just free eating and allowing yourself to not have that limit of restriction that normal diets have. So I think it's important to define the difference between intuitive eating and mindful eating, because sometimes these terms can be used interchangeably. So intuitive eating relies on hunger cues. Intuitive eating emphasizes trusting internal hunger and fullness cues and giving oneself unconditional permission to eat when hungry to promote cognitive change, reduce emotional eating, and increase shape acceptance. However, mindful eating relies on mindfulness practices. So it aims to apply these practices to internal sensations and increase present focused awareness, non-judgmental observation of bodily sensations, cognitions, and emotions. So in some of the research that I did, it does compare intuitive eating to mindful eating. So I think it's important to highlight the differences between those, and I'll get into a little bit more of the research here in a few minutes. So some important definitions. The first one here is restraint. So the definition of restraint is an act of restraining, the state of being restrained, or a control over the expression of one's emotions or thoughts. And I think restraint is a main focus when it comes to dieting, because you are restricting certain things. You are restricting certain foods, different times of eating during the day. And overall, it does have control over your emotions and thoughts in the process. Secondly, an important definition is self-efficacy. So that refers to an individual's belief in his or her capacity to execute behaviors necessary to produce specific performance attainments. So self-efficacy is the power that oneself has and able to achieve their goals. So achieve dieting, for instance, having the power to have control over what you eat. So when it comes to restraint, there are a few risk factors that are involved in that. So the first is disordered eating. When it comes to restraint, you're restraining yourself on food, on time. It could lead to disordered eating in the fact that you may not eat at the same time every day. You may not eat the same meals every day, which in fact can lead to binge eating. So with that restraint, restraining yourself from, say, not eating certain meals throughout the day or not eating enough for your body to be able to function with the energy needs, it could lead to overeating, which further can lead to obesity. So restraint is the main focus when it comes to dieting, and almost every diet includes some kind of restraint. So let's talk a little bit about the literature review. So the first study that I looked at was titled Contributions of Mindful Eating, Intuitive Eating, and Restraint to BMI, Disordered Eating, and Meal Consumption in College Students. So the purpose is, what are the correlations between intuitive eating, mindful eating, and restraint regarding BMI and disordered eating? So the design here is that the participants were asked to complete a 4-hour fast before attending the in-laboratory appointment, during which they completed a taste test meal. So that meal was pasta and tomato sauce, and then they were given surveys regarding eating-related attitudes, behaviors, and demographics. So basically, they had these college students come into the lab hungry, ate a meal, and then filled out a survey. Simple, right? So they were asked to fill out certain questionnaires. And these questionnaires are the Mindful Eating Questionnaire, 3-factor eating questionnaire, which is a restraint subscale, eating disorder diagnostic scale, and a hunger rating on a scale of 1 to 100, just to kind of measure how hungry they are as a control. And then they measured the amount of pasta at the end to determine how much of that they ate. So the inclusion criteria is undergraduates, being under the age of 18 years old, and a current student at this university. So here are the results. I'm going to use this pointer here to kind of describe what this table is showing. So over here on the left-hand side, you have all of the different variables, and at the top, the correlating number to each. And it just kind of uses the correlations between each variable to determine if there's any type of correlation between the two. So starting off here, you could see intuitive eating is compared to unconditional permission to eat. So that's a positive correlation. Intuitive eating is positively correlated to eating for physical reasons. Great. And then under 4, intuitive eating is also related to reliance on hunger cues. So everything I have in green is going to be a positive correlation, and everything in yellow is going to be a negative correlation. So comparing intuitive eating to mindful eating, it's a negative correlation. Secondly, intuitive eating compared to restraint, even more of a negative correlation. And between intuitive eating and disordered eating, even more of a negative correlation. And then also same goes for higher BMIs. So then if we look down here even further, we can compare restraint to disordered eating, a positive correlation. Restraint compared to higher BMI, a positive correlation. So further, you could see that these correlations define the fact that intuitive eating has a difference between mindful eating and when it comes to restraint and disordered eating. So some of the conclusions that they drew out from this research defines that the level of intuitive eating may better predict appropriate caloric consumption when responding to hunger or satiety cues. Elevated restraint may pose risk for eating disordered behaviors. Mindful eating was not significantly correlated with intuitive eating or restraint. So as we look back, mindful eating and intuitive eating are 2 separate components. So therefore, they shouldn't really be used interchangeably like they are. And lastly here, higher restraint and lower intuitive eating related to elevated risk for disordered eating. So that means more of the restrictive diets, lower body cues when it comes to eating, all lead to elevated risk for disordered eating. So some of the strengths of this study is that the demographics are representative of a general US college population. It had appropriate controls such as hunger levels and gender. It had a really large number of subjects, so 125 students participated. And it used 3 different measurement scales to quantify intuitive eating, mindful eating, and that level of restraint. So some of the limitations include that mindfulness practices are subjective. So when they were asked to practice mindfulness practices, it kind of can differ between person to person. Secondly, it used an older version of the IES scale, so that intuitive eating scale. Meal consumption can be influenced by taste preference. So maybe if one of the participants didn't like pasta, then they may not have eaten as much. And then this study was cross-sectional and doesn't really represent various groups, as it's mostly comprised of white female college students. So getting into the next study here, it's titled Intuitive Eating is Connected to Self-Reported Weight Stability in Community Women and Men. So the purpose here is to determine the influence that eating behaviors have on weight stability and variation. So the design here is that participants were asked to choose one of the 7 responses that best describes their weight pattern over the last year. And this, I would say, is kind of subjective depending on who you are. So these options are lost 5 to 10 pounds, lost more than 10 pounds, stable within 5 pounds, gained 5 to 10 pounds, gained more than 10 pounds, both lost and gained 5 to 10 pounds, and both lost and gained greater than 10 pounds. So then 2 groups were formed, the 5-pound categorization and the 10-pound categorization. So these determine the eating behavior differences of minor weight change with a more stringent definition of weight stability within 5 pounds, and more extreme weight change with a more lenient definition of weight stability, which is within 10 pounds. So participants were asked to report their desired weight, and then lastly, participants then responded to 2 scales. The intuitive eating scale, which is that same scale that was used in the previous study, and the cognitive restraint scale. So some inclusion criteria is that it includes U.S. community men and women. So participants were recruited from the Amazon Mechanical Turk, which I'm not quite sure what that means, but I'm just kind of assuming that it means that these participants work for Amazon. And conditions to exclude if women were pregnant or if at least one validity question was failed. So here are some results from that. So as you can see, once again, I'm using green and yellow. So yellow is more of a positive correlation, green is more of a negative. So there was a strong correlation between intuitive eating and self-reported weight stability. So right here, unconditional permission to eat was higher for weight stable individuals compared to those who lost 10 pounds. So looking at these differences, it's higher for weight stable participants rather than weight loss participants. Rigid and flexible control were linked to weight instability. So if you had more rigid control or were more strict of what you were eating, then it leads to more weight instability. Rigid but not flexible control was connected to weight gain and cycling, which underscores problems with prescribing diets that emphasize rigid control. And as an example, they used the keto diet, for instance, which has an extreme rigid control. So intuitive eating was related to lower desired weight change, whereas rigid and flexible control were related to higher desired weight change. So a few conclusions that they drew from this is that if weight stability is the goal, then intuitive eating is the better choice of the intervention. So some of the strengths of the study is that multiple dependent variables were used. So this means that some of the dependent variables are overall intuitive eating, eating for physical reasons, reliance on hunger and satiety cues, body food choice congruence, and unconditional permission to eat, whereas other controls are flexible control, rigid control, and then the body mass index. So it also covered a large population of 382 participants with an even gender distribution, and then study groups were also comparable. So limitations are that there was a reliance on self-reported recall of weight patterns. So it's more subjective. That means that some participants may not be truthful with reporting their weight recall. Recruitment of participants who were self-selected into the study. So they could basically participate on their own basis, and exclusion of extraneous variables that could impact findings, such as eating disorders, diagnosis of history, baseline weight, motivations for health improvement versus weight change, and breastfeeding. So they didn't really account for those variables. So next, getting into the last study here is actually a study from the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, and it's intuitive eating practices among African American women living with type 2 diabetes, and it's a qualitative study. So the purpose here was to determine if intuitive eating programs that improve self-efficacy and dietary habits can enhance glycemic control in African American women with type 2 diabetes. So the design here is that participants were split into 4 focus groups that consisted of 4 to 10 women. A moderator that was trained in qualitative methods and matched the participants' sex and ethnicity led each group using a guide that asks questions aloud to the group that assesses food and intuitive eating concepts. And then a scale was used to rank the 5 domains related to food intake and intuitive eating. So essentially, they had groups of women all together where the moderator fit their ethnicity and age and basically conducted just like a group discussion on different intuitive eating subjects. So the responses to 28 questions were answered using a 4-point Likert scale ranging from 1, which is strongly disagree, to 4, strongly agree. Higher scores indicated greater adherence to intuitive eating principles. So the inclusion criteria is African American women who have received a physician diagnosis of type 2 diabetes and had received care within the health system between 2009 and 2012. And then the exclusion criteria is not fitting within the inclusion criteria, and the participants have the choice just not to participate. So these are some examples of the questions that are asked. So how, if all, do you think the food that we eat affects our health? Where do you eat? While you're eating, what do you do to really enjoy your food? And what sorts of things make it difficult to eat healthy? So like I said, these groups of women basically just had a discussion on what these questions mean to them. So putting it into some of the results, a dependent variable, for instance, is influence of diabetes diagnosis on diet. And the consensus from this is that limited success in changing eating habits for diabetes. So they may not be successful in changing their eating habits after a diagnosis. They commonly try to decrease the amount of candy and other sweets consumed. The diabetic diet consists of good foods and bad foods, which, as we're in the field of nutrition, we try to tell our patients that, it's not the difference between good foods and bad foods. It's the difference between foods that are higher in carbohydrates and foods that are lower. And lastly, some thought that fruit was bad for diabetics and should be avoided. So secondly, feelings of stigma and guilt associated with diabetes. Now we'll just touch on this a little bit. So these participants felt like they were the only ones in their family with diabetes, tried to hide it from their families. They had a fear that they were trapped in a certain dietary pattern. And many reported that family and friends would refuse to allow the women to consume available foods perceived as unhealthy and expressed frustration that they were not allowed to make this decision for themselves. So there was a lot of guilt associated with this diagnosis. And lastly, looking at the recognition of intuitive eating practices, these women describe that they know the feelings of fullness cues, such as being physically uncomfortable, sleepy, or sick, or having a lack of hunger. When food was no longer available or time constraints necessitated a change in activity, so they knew when to stop eating. Moreover, the intuitive eating score was about 2.5 on a scale of 1 to 5, plus minus 0.3. So that just means that they do have a sense of intuitive eating, but there needs to be more diet education to further enhance the way that they participate in intuitive eating. So the conclusion is that because self-efficacy is a strong predictor of successful diabetes management, the inclusion of training to improve self-efficacy and increased awareness in intuitive eating interventions could thus be beneficial to African American women with diabetes. So the strengths of this is that it targets a very specific population. However, limitations are that some of the women in the group knew each other and shared common interests, decreasing the ability to generalize the results to other groups. So, moreover, they just kind of agreed on topics that each woman would bring up. And all of the participants were from the Southeast, and it may not reflect other regions of the United States. So here are some final take-home messages from this research. Intuitive eating has a positive influence on self-efficacy and limits restrictions in the diet, as it plays a role in later stages of eating disordered MNT. It's appropriate for many populations. It has the largest influence on people who want to maintain weight. Along with the need for diet education, this therapy technique can show positive results for people who have type 2 diabetes. And the research shows no signs of limitations between population demographics. So that's between gender, age, and ethnicities. So here are my references, and I will open it up to any questions.
Thank you so much, Julia. That was a great presentation. I just want to mention to everybody that I am going to be sending that presentation evaluation link one more time. So if you could fill that out for Julie and give her some feedback, that would be great. And then just a reminder, you can ask any questions either in the chat or you can unmute yourself and ask her yourself. And then also just a reminder that the last presentation will be at 11:35, which is with Elena, and is the effects of skipping breakfast. So yeah, we'll see you there.
All right, I do have a question here about a book recommendation that covers intuitive eating. So I have not read any particular books on intuitive eating for this study. However, looking at that website that I talked about in the beginning, the original Intuitive Eating Pros, they do have a list of numerous books that have research on this topic. And then the slides can be found on the Weebly website. Rachel, I don't know if you want to post the link to that. Oh, there we go. Perfect timing. Thanks, Rachel. I also want to mention, if you do have any questions in the future, I did post my contact information on this last slide. So you're more than welcome to send me an email with any questions that you think of after the presentation as well. All right, a question from Danielle here says, what would you like to see for future research on intuitive eating? I think just more so the awareness of intuitive eating, and just talking about what exactly it can do for patients that are not only eating disordered patients, but patients who want to maintain weight, patients who have diabetes, or patients that just simply have questions about dieting in general. Um, I think the more research that is out there will bring more of this practice to light. And I'm hopeful that it'll be more involved in MNT practices in the future, because not a lot of people are aware of intuitive eating. And like, it's more so the sense of how we adapt to our hunger cues. And a lot of people tend to eat, especially like in an Americanized diet, not only when they're hungry, but kind of like eat for boredom, eat because the food looks good, eat because they have to with different times of the day. Um, so I think that's basically the future of what I want to see. And thank you, Heather, for posting a few titles of some books. Yes, thank you so much to everyone who stayed and listened. I appreciate it.